We now move into this fifth tenet of Operation HASTEN, which is evangelizing the cities. In this, there's a lot of confusion, I think, to what evangelism actually means. But we're given the promise that we need not walk in darkness on this matter. I think it seems that everybody has an understanding, that even the Pope obviously has an understanding that we need to evangelize, but many have different methods on what evangelism actually is, what it looks like. Some think of evangelism and they think of the fancy TV preacher, right? The one that flies on his fancy jet. Others think about flying halfway across the world to another country in order to spend a few days teaching orphans, taking their obligatory photo opportunity, and then going on a safari for the next 2 weeks, calling this evangelism. Others, to the extreme, look at standing on the street corner of a busy city and yelling at people they're going to go to hell, calling this evangelism. Now, while we are told that we need to bear this message that John the Baptist of a watchman, I'm curious the effectiveness of a message of the watchman. We read again how John the Baptist was pronounced as one of the greatest prophets, yet what a contrast, she reads, what a contrast between the language of this man and those many ministers on the cross. Ministers of the cross. So it definitely is a need for a watchman, but I think that what we also find later is the effectiveness in this time. We need for something more. We read preaching is just a small part of the work that is to be done for the salvation of souls, and that publications must be multiplied and scattered like the leaves of autumn. More in alignment for what we're told to do is handing out literature, scattered like the leaves of autumn. And we see people going on the streets and handing out globe tracts and great controversies. And, it is a numbers game after all. So, it's important to get that message out. But this is not the end of it. This is only planting a seed. And if all you do is hand out a bunch of books, then go back to your room, you're not really doing evangelism. Right? Seeds must be nurtured. Right? We must be there then to answer the questions. More than that, to establish relationships. Right? We need to be intentional about our interactions. In order to lead souls to Jesus, there must be a knowledge of the human nature and a study of the human mind. Much careful thought and fervent prayer are required to know how to approach men and women on the greatest subject of truth. This is not something you can just casually do. It has to have some intentionality behind it. Right? Like Enoch, we should be bringing them back to our country property and helping them experience what God's way of living is, right? Showing them what the advantages are of God's way of living. They should see for themselves this advantages over God's way versus the world. Right? People coming to you and living in an experiential evangelism is far more effective, I believe, than shouting, you're going to go to hell on a street corner. I think what we need to be focused on is this idea of inbound evangelism. Now, you don't get stuck on the name. It could be experiential and immersive evangelism, right? Enochian evangelism. The point simply is there needs to be a change of how this is done. And I've been very interested in this idea of woofing personally. And I see some practical application to it. I think it needs to be, being part of a community to give this message, I think, will be much more effective. But the point simply is there are different ways where you can bring people in. This is what I believe the Advent Outpost directory is going to be really beautiful for. This idea of having a different directory of locations where we can bring people and send people with different needs at different stages, different walks. And from this, having activities that speak about true education, going back to the old idea of unselfishness. This is going to be the theme of this entire video, is unselfishness, and opening opportunities and seeing, different initiatives that can be done. Right? This whole idea of this working the cities from outpost centers, right? It's inbound evangelism. It's going into the cities, not living in them, right? But living in the country and working the cities. Working the cities from outpost centers, and then having institutions for publications of literature, healing the sick, and for the training of workers. These are to be established outside the cities. And so we have instructions on what this formula is for an outpost. It's healing of the sick, training of workers, it's media publications. Ultimately, there are three main pillars: the ministry, the homestead, and the business. We read, "It is God's design that our people should locate from out of the cities, and from these outposts warn the cities." So there's a message of warning, but it's be given from an outpost. We read, "It is these must be a force of influence in the cities and provide a message of warning." So an outpost has two roles. Right? There's an interesting perspective in the historical definition of an outpost. It's a small military camp, again, this military theme always appears, or a position some distance from the main army, used especially to guard against a surprise attack. So it's guarding and attacking. So if you think about where should my outpost be, it needs to be far enough to shield yourself from distractive influences. This could be just outside the city limits. Right? In a small village, it could be obviously further than that, but it must be close enough to attack. If you think your idea is to go get a piece of country property 5 hours away, 3 hours away, 2 hours away from any place that you can do evangelism from, then you're more looking to hide out for self versus doing what God has asked. So again, far enough to shield, but close enough to attack. We must make wise plans to warn the cities, at the same time live where we can shield our children and ourselves. Again, not all outposts are going to be the same, but there's a general formula of how we are to work them. I think it's interesting is that a lot of people start the formula with a homestead. And a homestead is a place where we can have a garden, right? We can have a home outside the city. We can provide for ourselves and our family. We can protect from enemies in a place where we can grow closer to God. But if we're to look at the theme of all of these are all focused on self. And so a homestead on its own is not an outpost. We must focus on others. An outpost must include a ministry. But even in this order, it's a broken outpost. Many think that, let's start with a homestead. Let's attract some people together, live together, and then we're going to do God's will. What they're not recognizing is that you're likely going to be attracting people who think of themselves first. And when tough times get tough, right, the community is going to fall apart. And so this formula of a homestead plus ministry is a broken formula. I highly recommend watching my full course on what is an outpost formula, where I got much dive deeper into this. But the short of it is, we need to fix the order of things. Because the sin which is indulged to the greatest extent and which separates from God is selfishness. There can be no returning to the Lord except through self-denial. If we're selfish, that is the sin that separates us from God. And so a homestead first is selfish. So we must go ministry first and then establish our homestead around that, right? The priorities must be in order. We read that the love of God has been lost, and in this means the absence of love for one another. Self, self, self is what's cherished, and striving for supremacy. This is why evangelism is not working, because we're too selfish. We have far more to fear from within than without. We have people that are hindering the work of God. It says how often the possessed advocates professed of truth are standing in the way. Selfishness is standing in our way of progress. Let us be careful to not counterwork and hinder the progress of others, delaying the gospel message. Right? When people think about us, we read, worldlings look on and exclaim, "Behold, look how Christians hate one another. If this is religion, we do not want it." And they look upon themselves and their irreligious characters with great satisfaction. How are we giving atheists the moral high ground? Unbelievers have a right to expect that those who profess to be Sabbath keeping the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus will do more than any other class to promote and honor their consistent lives by godly example and active influence. The cause is what they should be representing. And yet, we have people that say, "I like your Christ, but not your Christianity." The strongest argument in the favor of a gospel is a loving and lovable Christian. This means other-centeredness. It means not focus on self. And so this is why evangelism is broken. This is why evangelism is not going to work for us. We read, the influence of these old church members focused on self will leaven the members of those newly coming to the faith. The Lord does not now work to bring many souls to the truth because the church members who have never been converted and those who were once converted but have backslidden. What influence would these unconsecrated members have in new churches? And so the idea is that there is currently no chance of evangelistic success. Now you may read, here's example and review in Adventist Review, baptism reached 100,000 in a wonderful miracle in Rwanda. Okay, and in the same article it says, now if you can give a donation of $3,000. The whole point is, yes, there may be reports of miracles working, but in the same regard, it feels like it's more wrapped around somebody's ego, their selfishness of wanting to show that what the huge things that they did for God. We read, it's a solemn statement I make to the church that not 1 in 20 whose names are registered in the books are prepared to close Earth's history. What we're finding is that it's the same as in the 80s. We're just bringing people in. We're diluting our church membership with people who are not consecrated because they're being brought in by other people who are not consecrated. We read, the efforts made to cleanse the church away from moral uncleanness must be made in God's way. In laboring where there are already some in the faith, the minister should at first seek not so much to convert unbelievers as to train the church members for acceptable cooperation. You get it? So the whole idea is that this is not about converting unbelievers. It's about first getting a reconciliation with those that are in the church. We need acceptable cooperation. This means not to be looking at the TV, not to be looking up at the minister even and saying, how is the minister going to be doing this message of work? It means actually taking active, proactive measurement in this effort. A revival of true godliness among us is the greatest and most urgent of all our needs. To seek this should be our first work. Our first work must be a revival internally of true godliness. Not going out and trying to evangelize the world when we ourselves have not been evangelized. We ourselves are not fully converted. The member of the church need to be awakened and realize the responsibility they have to make these truths known to others. And those who have been enlightened by the truth must be light bearers to the world. Now, I highly recommend deep diving on my course on Watchmen and Light Bearers. There's a 3-part series on my channel. But the point simply is this. We need to stop giving the gospel message and start living the gospel message. Prosperity will never attend these churches until the individual members shall be closely connected with God. Do you read that? We will never have prosperity in evangelism until we have a closer connection with God. And this means what? By having an unselfish interest in the salvation of our fellow men. Again, it goes back to unselfishness. All the preaching in the world will not make men feel deeply the need for the perishing souls around them. Nothing will arouse self-sacrificing zeal as to send them forth in new fields to work for those in darkness. Not for himself did Christ work, but for others did he live and thought and prayed. We need to use Christ as our example. He was fully other-centered. The Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister. How many of us are going to church in order wanting to get fed? Instead of going to church and thinking about how can we add, what value can we bring? Look not into every man of his own things, but unto every man also into the things of others, being other-centered. Bear you one another's burdens. This is the law of Christ. As you would men do unto you, think about others. What are you able to do, right? This idea of encouraging one another, building each other up. This includes forgiveness, it includes love. We need radical generosity. And until we can reach this point, we are lost, we're doomed. It says here in Deuteronomy, open your hand wide unto your brother, and to the poor, and to the needy. Give to that who asks. Right? Freely you've received, freely give. Withhold not when it's in thy power and thy hand to do, distributing the necessary to the saints. Now again, this doesn't get into being, Ellen White also tells us not to be part of the Salvation Army, but it's this idea of understanding of true selflessness and charity. Let him that has 2 coats impart to him that has 1. And forget not to do and share in those in need. These are the sacrifices that please God. How fast would the gospel spread if we had a living connection with Christ and then started living like Christ? I want to leave us with this concept. And again, there's so much more that should be said in this, and I have other videos that are on this topic, but I want to leave this concept of this, is that We may have an idea of giving a gospel message, but if we're not doing it in a way that has any power, what's the point? And if all we're doing is just planting some seeds, but then never actually wanting to water or nurture the seeds, what's the point? There needs to be a revival of true godliness. There needs to be a heart searching. And from there, we won't be able to stop giving the gospel message. When we are in love with Christ, all we will be able to do is spend all of our time and all of our focus on him. And so rather than begrudgingly going and handing out a few tracts one time or here and there, we should be thinking about how can we get right? How can we develop that love relationship? I do want to point out there is a sense of urgency. And we see the way that the freedom of speech is being restricted. It will not be much longer until it will be illegal to say the things that we need to say. It will be illegal to spread the gospel message. And so if we are all called to give the gospel message, both as watchmen, yes, but also as light bearers, if we wait until it's illegal to do so, one, we will wait too late. But two, why put ourselves through that? Why not get out now and tell our friends now before they're jaded against the idea of what we have to say? So start spreading the message to your friends and your family, but do it through love and start with a personal relationship with Christ and really building that and thinking about how can I build also a place like Enoch? How can I have a place that people can come to and see a demonstration of what God's way is? Because we can preach God's way, but without demonstrating it, it's not as effective. Again, and this all comes back down to the next chapter, which is nurturing Christ-like characters.